Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
The rabbis were keenly aware that Sarah was missing from the text, and they go about answering the question of where she was during the Akedah in the process of answering other exegetical questions. So for example, Bereshit Rabbah 58:5 asks the question apropos of the pasuk Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah, that Abraham came to eulogize Sarah, and they ask, where did he come from? And that becomes an occasion for them to consider, oh, is it possible that he came from his father Terach's funeral? And they rule out that option, and then they say, actually, that he came from Har HaMoriah, from Mount Moriah, from the episode of the Akedah, to Sarah's funeral, because as soon as she heard about what had happened to her son, that Abraham had taken him to be bound, she died out of shock. So that's one explanation. And they also use that as an occasion to ask a typical question about Smichut Parshiot, the adjacency of episodes in the Bible, right? So why is it that you have the Akedah and right after that, the death of Sarah? So they see that as cluing us to the fact that Sarah couldn't have known or didn't participate, wasn't of the same mind as Abraham about the idea of the Akedah. That's one instance. In another case, in a midrash from Tanchuma, there's a whole kind of strategy and machination that's posited about where Sarah was. Abraham knows that he couldn't possibly just take away her son without telling her, given how close she was to this one son she had, whom she waited for so long, and assumes that he couldn't just share with her the idea that he had this charge, this commandment from God to go sacrifice the son, because it says, Nashim datan kala. In other words, women don't have a firm enough spiritual constitution to withstand such a thing. And so Abraham has to resort to a stratagem of buttering her up and making a whole big dinner and saying, we have a son and this son needs to be educated, and so I'm going to take him on a father-son retreat, so to speak, to begin his education. And that's a very interesting and crazy source for all kinds of reasons, because what it assumes about women's spirituality, and also what it assumes about the Akedah, that it has to be a ruse perpetrated by the patriarch against his wife. And the way that I have read this story is that, very tragically, it pits the love of God against the love of your child. That God specifically announces, this son that you loved, as a way of demonstrating your love for me above your worldly attachments. And I'm not the first to notice this, because one of the most famous Rashis on this episode looks at the fact that Abraham saddled his donkey by himself, which is not a regular practice for someone who had Abraham's means. He would have had a servant do that, and we see servants appear in this episode. So why is he doing it by himself? And the answer that Rashi brings, he inherits from the rabbis, is ahava mekalkelet et hashura, that love disrupts the regular rule of things. And the question is, love for whom? And the very ambiguity of that suggests that there's something in play here. Where is the love going to fall out? Is the love going to fall out on the side of God, or is the love going to fall out on the side of your worldly attachments, your family members? And the great tragedy of the story is that love disappears from the story. It announces and begins the story of the Akedah, but we never see that principle of love recur. And later, when the angel appears and stays Abraham's hand and says, don't do this, al na tishlach yadcha banar, because now I see that you are a God-fearer. And lo chasachta et bincha et yechidcha, that you didn't withhold your son, your only son from me. And it doesn't say the son you loved, because the principle of love gets eradicated in the course of the story as Abraham foregrounds and demonstrates his capacity for awe and fear of God. So one way to read this story is a story of testing out which principle is going to win, love or fear. And in the end, fear wins and love seemingly disappears from the text. Feminists, generally speaking, don't like the story the way it turns out. Feminists, insofar as feminists are trained first and foremost to look for the perspective of women, or to look for women characters in the story, Sarah's obvious absence of the story is a siren. You know, where is Sarah? And so a feminist reading often begins with asking the question that we asked before, where is she? Feminist readers will then move from looking for that female character and for her absence, and they will look at the way in which traditional exegetes had approached the story, and can they identify their own questions or their own perspectives in that traditional material. Sometimes you're surprised to discover that the supposedly patriarchal tradition has counter-traditional elements that take into account a woman's perspective that you wouldn't expect to find there. My teacher, Ilana Pardes, has championed that kind of counter-traditional reading of the Bible. But often what women readers or feminist readers, whether they're male or female, will discover is that their perspective isn't well represented in the traditional exegesis of the text, and that will lead to a certain kind of suspicious approach to what has preceded them, and they will look at the way in which the text conditions a kind of androcentric experience or an androcentric reading and try and tease out an alternative. If you're a religious person, you want to live with this text. You're not only content to critique and deconstruct its harmful elements with respect to the women's experience, then you will want to resort to the next stage hermeneutic, which is to reconstruct the text or find some way of reading that isn't well represented in what we have seen traditionally. And in our case, the whole question of where ahava appears or disappears in the text occasions a feminist reconstructive reading. And what I mean by that is as follows. One approach and in fact, this is a feminist approach, a supposedly feminist approach to the text, is to protest the fact that Sarah wasn't there in the text and to kind of urge her into it. Sarah was the one who was so attached to her son, and if this was supposed to be an exercise in detachment, here I'm quoting a perspective brought by feminist critic Phyllis Tribble, one of the founders of feminist biblical approaches to the Bible, at least second wave founders. Phyllis Tribble says, if this is an exercise of transcendent detachment from your earthly connections, well, Sarah was the one who was so attached to Isaac, and so she should have been given this spiritual exercise of going out onto a mountain and detaching from her son. I do not wish to follow that approach. I do not see as a feminist the need or identify with the desire to see women on that mountain. And in fact, I see the disappearance of the ahava principle at the end of the story as a way of posing a feminist alternative. Because the next place, and so this is the reconstructive hermeneutic, the next place where the verb ahava appears in the Bible is when Abraham's servant has been sent to Haran to get a spouse for Isaac. This is something that Abraham doesn't do himself. He does in a detached way because he's so detached at that point at the end of the story that he plays little role in anybody's life. He only plays a role in Sarah's death, in buying a death plot. They are no longer living together at the end of the story. Abraham and Isaac are no longer walking together at the end of the story. So all attachments, except for this fearful attachment with God, have been severed at the end of the Akedah. And Sarah, whom we think has been disappeared from the story, she actually recurs even after she has died in Genesis 24, because Abraham brings Rebecca, into his mother Sarah's tent, and it says he loves her. Vayehaveha. So the love principle that had been eradicated at the end of the Akedah story is recuperated through the model of Sarah. And Sarah therefore becomes the mode, the medium of passing on the tradition to the child, because by definition, the Akedah, had it been consummated, would have cut the very idea of transmission. That's the crazy paradox of the story. God's founding a nation through Abraham, and yet God is asking everyone to do this spiritual exercise of annihilating that very promise of the nation. So the possibility of a domestic, love-centered transmission of the tradition is resuscitated through Sarah, even after her death. Well, on some level, this reading gets in the way of our venerating the story in the traditional way that we had. I mean, if Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is brought as an example of his tremendous merit, like zchut avot, and that God should forgive us, you know, our sins on the high holidays by dint of Abraham's willingness to undergo this exercise, and I've just debunked it, and I've said, well, it's an exercise of awe rather than love, it might get in the way of our venerating that story in exactly that way. It strikes me that it might still be possible to appreciate this as a story of awe on the Yamim HaNoraim, which on the days of awe, that it's a story that is set apart on a mountain, detached from our regular experience, connected to this atypical, non-domesticated experience of the Yamim Noraim, of going to synagogue for so many hours. For some people, it's the only time that they actually go to synagogue, right? So you could see how this is like a splendidly detached narrative. And so if you cling to the notion of days of awe, so then you might still be able to keep that traditional reading. But for those of us who find it so troubling to imagine that Abraham passed the test, that this is supposed to be an example of anything, of how to live, I believe that the feminist reading allows us to live with the story and to suggest that the Bible is very honest about the cost of violence and passion in religious life. Right? That violence and passion, and even like a murderous impulse, killing for, sacrificing and killing for the sake of a value. In some instances, they're called for, but they come with a cost. The Bible doesn't flinch in the face of that cost. The relationships that were there in the story before him do not survive that story. Right? So Abram no longer walks yachdav with his child. He walks with his servants, whom he doesn't have an emotional attachment to. His wife isn't there with him, and in fact, he's not living with his wife at the end of the story. So those impulses and strains are there. They have to be harnessed on occasion, but they need to be recognized for what they are. So for example, in modern life, in modern Zionist life, the Akedah is a story that's endlessly repeated in modern Israeli Hebrew poetry. As a recognition of a fact that parents are readily, in every generation, binding their children to the cause by sending them to serve in the army. This is not something that's celebrated. It's just a fact. And in fact, it's lamented. Often feminist writers, poets, they'll say, hey, like, lo b'ni, says the poet Raya Harnick. I'm not going to participate in that story. So it opens up, an honest reading of the Akedah opens up the possibility of recognizing the presence, the power, but the cost of those sorts of impulses and stories, and recognizing that this is a high-pitched, detached, exceptional narrative. Don't try this at home. necessitates, calls for a different model for those of us who do want to practice religion at home, who want to imagine a connection in God, with God, that doesn't require us to sacrifice our children, but like to bind our children to our ways, our everyday ways, rather than to bind our children to these impossible, violent ways.